Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. TradeMe is bidding farewell to some of its marketplace fees. From March 10, sellers won't have to pay a 7.9% success fee when they sell things like their couch, a dress, a lamp or the TV. The platforms said it wants to make it easier for Kiwis to declutter their homes, say goodbye to their secondhand stuff and get some extra cash in their pockets. But is the change actually about that? Or is TradeMe getting outshone by other online marketplaces? Today on The Front Page, Massey University marketing expert Bodo Lang is with us to talk about our obsession with selling our old stuff. Bodo, let's just first start off about talking about TradeMe. Do you reckon it is actually as popular as it once was?
I think, that's a good question. I think certainly TradeMe has been extremely popular, and I think it's probably suffered a little bit from increasing competition from other traditional sort of online retailers, I guess, and then new online retailers as well, and then other type marketplace type things. So I don't think it's quite as, it's not, in marketing we often say top of mind awareness. People are still aware of it, but I just don't know whether it's quite as prominent a factor in people's lives as it used to be.
It is obviously being ousted by other competition online. What is more popular these days?
I think there's a number of different channels. So I think, traditionally, if you dial the clock back 27 years ago when I was working with the founder of TradeMe, and it was very interesting. New Zealand was a different place. There was, there was an internet, but it was nothing to speak of. And we certainly didn't have access to online retailing. Well, 2026, we have not just online retailing within New Zealand, but we have online retailing globally, and particularly from China and other Southeast Asian countries. And so New Zealand consumers are now have an amazing choice basically at their fingertips. And within a couple of days, maybe a week, they have access to the actual physical good and holding it in their hands. So the marketplace has changed dramatically since the days when TradeMe was started. And so I think the marketplace has, the market has changed so fundamentally that I think it's really, really important for established businesses like TradeMe to look at their business model, not just at fee structures, but even at their business model to say, what are the trends? How can we keep up to date with this?
Yeah, and you mentioned that you started off and worked with the founder back in, 99 when it first operated. How do you think, if you were to work with them again and say, look, we need a complete brand refresh, what would be one of the first things that you suggest?
I think the brand is certainly instilled in New Zealanders' minds, but I think refreshing the brand could be part of it. But I also think that it's the user interface. It hasn't evolved terribly, I think, and maybe that's also a way of saying that it's been successful and there's no need to change it. But I do think that consumers are used to big tech every day, whether that's their streaming platform on a big screen or on a TV, or music streaming on a small screen, either mobile or social media on their small screens. And so I think these kind of platforms, they continuously update and they always nudge the design forward. Not always for the better, I think it's fair to say, but there's continuous change and they look very sharp, I have to say. And so generally the experience is very pleasant and it's visually appealing and it's also very seamless. I do think that TradeMe has fallen a little bit behind on that because it feels like a more traditional model. And yes, it's different from social media, but I think people are used to that social media look and feel nowadays. And so I think TradeMe would do really well to think of design and even steps that customers, both buyers and sellers, have to go through in order to get a transaction done.
Now, I understand that TradeMe brought in its success fees model in the 2000s, and that's when it was the country's most visited site. 500,000 daily visitors by 2009, actually, which is astronomical. 52% of those listings were secondhand. What do you make of the change to actually abolish the seller fee altogether?
Look, I think it's a good move because what consumers generally crave is transparency, and obviously the lower the fees, the better. And so there's two things here that happen together. And so things have become more transparent, I think, which is good. And also fees for most casual sellers have decreased, and that's massive. And so how can TradeMe take advantage of this? I think they really need to advertise this heavily, not just on site, because then you only hit the people who are already using the service. But it's really about spreading that message well beyond TradeMe's own website, basically into maybe traditional advertising, social media advertising, just to get people hooked in. Because my sense is that other operators like Facebook Marketplace have a huge advantage. And that advantage is that they're part of many people's social media diet. And TradeMe is not part of many people's social media diet. There might be some people, a proportion of New Zealanders who are logging on daily or weekly or whatever. But I think having that advantage really makes a big difference. And so I think you need to get people back on site. And I think talking about fees, lower fees, most Kiwis will save money. Those messages need to spread well beyond TradeMe's own website.
Do you reckon that the talk of these fees and dependent on how successful TradeMe is from here on out will prompt actually other online marketplaces to get rid of their commission fees perhaps? Because I was looking up, one of the sites that I use quite often is Designer Wardrobe, which is more, like a TradeMe for fashion and accessories and brands and things like that. I wasn't actually aware that they actually take a 12.95% commission rates on sales over $40, which I'll put my hand up and say most of my sales, things I buy are over $40. What is the likelihood of those other sites looking at them and being like, hey, I think we're going to follow suit?
I think the likelihood is very, very high. And that's not just for direct competitors. So you could say designer wardrobe, yeah, there's some overlap, but they're obviously very much specialized on clothing and I suspect female clothing. And so there's a relatively small overlap. But even sites like this will take note of what's being done by the big players and then say, look, if that becomes an expectation of users more broadly, what do we need to do in order to fulfill that expectation, even though it might not be explicit? And so, as soon as big players change the rules of how they engage with their users, that has spillover effects to other platforms as well, and much smaller platforms. So it's it's like a delicate balance, the marketplace. And I think as soon as one thing happens over here, then other players are certainly looking at it, and then they will have to reflect on, well, do we want to follow suit or not, and what are the pros and cons? But I think if big players change the rules, I think smaller players are likely to follow.
I can imagine that TradeMe's exist doing this and doing their complete, like they're also shifting how members pay for goods as well. And we'll talk about that in a second. But even just the security aspect, they could probably push on a bit more. Hey, and I'll just say I sold a cat tree on Facebook Marketplace, and I'm still getting messages from people asking if it's available like 2 months later. The ease and the relatively easy interface and the security aspect is a really important one with TradeMe as well. Hey.
Absolutely. Ease of use. So, from academic literature, we know that there are two key drivers, and they're not the only ones, but they are the two key drivers of why people, so users, use a platform. And the first one is ease of use. How easy is it to use that platform? And number two, not surprisingly, what is the perceived usefulness of that platform? And so if you say, look, 80% of the success of my platform is dependent on those two factors, then you've got a good grasp on your business. So usefulness, you can say, look, the online security and not being fraudulently separated from your money that you've shifted across to somebody else's account via bank transfer. I think that's really, really important. It's maybe not the first thing that people think about, but certainly there are enough Kiwis, losing money. And if it's a bank transfer, there's very little that TradeMe can do about this. And even banks can't do much about this. And there have been some well-publicized cases. So bringing that more in-house for TradeMe and saying, look, you have to pay via Ping, or you can still do cash if you prefer. But if you use Ping, there is a small fee of 2.19% or something, but that also means we can keep a tab on that. And I think that will be a really useful feature for a lot of Kiwis who are selling goods that are worth more than just a few dollars.
Yeah, because I saw in TradeMe's press release that they actually said that 90% of the scams on the site that they couldn't help customers with involved bank transfers. And I understand unless you've got cash on Facebook Marketplace when you're picking up a cat tree or something, you do have to rely on bank transfers. Hey.
Yes, that's right. And so I think bank transfers are really easy and convenient, and people are generally reluctant to sign up to another payment provider, like paying or whatever else it might be. But there are actually massive advantages to this if you're talking about sensible sums. If you're buying something for $2.50 and that money goes missing, not such a big deal. But if you're paying for anything more than worth, I don't know, $20, $30, you probably want to see that money being put to the use that you intended it for. So I think having security around this is a nice to have, and certainly for people who've been fraudulently separated from their money in the past, this will be a key driver of their behavior. They will never probably buy or use bank transfer again in their life.
We're removing success fees for casual sellers on TradeMe Marketplace. We want TradeMe to be the safest, most rewarding place to buy and sell in Aotearoa, which is why we'll be rolling out these changes over the next week. That 7.9% cut we used to take will soon be gone. From furniture to fashion, you sell it, you keep the profit.
One thing I think that TradeMe really does, and it stands out above the rest, is that it is a Kiwi-based company, right? I mean, eBay failed in the early 2000s in coming into this market because it kind of highlighted TradeMe's cultural fit. Do you think that they've lost a little bit of that, and should they push more on the Kiwi marketplace aspect of it?
I think that's a great comment, and I remember, Sam Morgan started the company, and he did a really good job at just encapsulating that identity, because of he was obviously aware that that eBay could have just come across, and they didn't because New Zealand is a small market. So I think that's a nice to have. I think it's a good thing to have, but I think the key reason why people use these platforms is because there's lots of choice. It's easy to engage with the platform, and it's easy to pay. And so I think it's a feel-good factor. It would play a role, but I think it's one of those things, often we see this when people declare what's important to them in a survey. They say, oh yes, the environment is very important and this and that and human rights and this and that. And then when you look at actual purchase behaviors, often that declared sort of pro-social behavior or pro-New Zealand behavior really quickly disappears or diminishes. Maybe not entirely, but it diminishes because another product that may not be Kiwi made is much cheaper, and then they go, oh well, I'll go with that. So there's always this big attitude behavior gap that we talk about in marketing, and I think you get some mileage out of honing in on, hey, this is New Zealand owned and operated, and we have a blue Kiwi as a logo and so forth. But I think it only carries you so far. So it's super important that you're doing a fantastic job on the must-dos, not on the nice-to-haves.
And there is actually a real surge in popularity for things like car boot sales, op shopping, thrift shopping. Do you reckon we're going full circle?
I think some people like this reconnection. I don't think we will see those big online platforms disappear anytime soon. It's a very convenient way to get access to a lot of different products, some of them new, some of them used. But I think people also crave the sense of face-to-face communication and connecting with people and a sense of community. And I think that's what these online places can only give to a very limited extent. So I think there will always be a place for these online and offline places where people trade things. We have farmers markets. There are opportunities for people to still connect in person and, to be known by name and to sort of become, part of somebody else's narrative. And I think those are important drivers for some consumers. But ultimately, convenience rules the roost. And online is incredibly convenient and gives you so much choice. I think it's very hard to beat that with bricks and mortar, and you only need to ask any New Zealand retailer about their battle, and it's battle with online basically.
And you mentioned there's the nice to haves, there's the must dos. So one of the must dos, presuming, is the taking care of the service fees. What do you reckon should be next cab off the rank?
I think it's having a really good competitive analysis of saying, okay, well, who are we competing with at the moment and who will we be competing with in the future? And I think the really big item that I'm sure is on everybody's minds is AI-assisted shopping. So still, AI needs to find stuff online that people are willing to sell. So if I have a cat tree sitting on my desk, AI doesn't know about this, so it has to somehow be put online. So then the question is, how well are these platforms set up for allowing AI to harvest the data and to make purchase decisions on behalf of, or even just putting a shortlist together on behalf of you or me if you're looking for a cat tree. So it's, technology has been relatively stable for a long time, but AI is set to be, or has already been, a major disruption for many industries. So I think looking forward to that, I think, is really, really critical, because if your platform is not AI integrated and in, let's say, 5 years' time, 25% of people buy things through AI-assisted shopping, well, you're just not there, basically. So I think that's a medium-term, super important thing. The other thing is I don't have the insights on this, but I think the most obvious thing I would do as a market researcher would be to say, what happens to users? Why do users defect? Why do they not continue using the platform? And any company that's worth its salt would do a really good exit interview in that sense, and just every quarter or so talk to these people and say, what are the big things why people are dropping off? Some things it won't be able to do anything about, change in lifestyle, moving countries, whatever it might be. But other things it will certainly be able to do something about. So I think an analysis of what are the reasons why people are leaving us or using us less frequently is super important.
Thanks for joining us, Bodo.
My pleasure.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is hosted and produced by me, Chelsea Daniels. Kane Dickey is our studio operator, Richard Martin, our producer and editor, and our executive producer is Jane Yee. Follow The Front Page on the iHeart app or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time for another look beyond the headlines.